Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage John J. DeGioia, President of Georgetown University, Frederick Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, former National Security Advisors Brent Scowcroft, Stephen Hadley, and James Jones.
Well, good afternoon. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to welcome you all here to Gaston Hall for this important and timely dialogue surrounding the challenges and changing landscape of national security in the 21st century. It's an honor to be joined by three distinguished former national security advisors who have served Presidents Ford, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and President Obama. I'd like to thank Brent Scowcroft, Stephen Hadley, and General James Jones for being with us today. We're deeply grateful for their service to our nation and that they could join us to share their knowledge and experience with our community. I also wish to recognize Fred Kemp, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Atlantic Council, who will moderate today's discussion. And I'll have an opportunity to say a little bit more about Mr. Kemp in just a few moments. I'd also like to express my gratitude to our students who, through the work of our lecture fund, have helped to make this event possible. We gather here today to hear firsthand perspectives from three individuals whose distinguished careers give them a deep understanding of the complex work of national security. In their careers of service, each of them coordinated across the federal government to advise the President on one of his most solemn responsibilities: ensuring the safety and security of Americans at home and abroad. Recent events, such as the protests and violence at embassies in the Middle East and North Africa, mass shootings here in the United States in houses of worship and other public spaces, reflect the depth and breadth of the type of threats, the countless complicating factors, and the underlying complexity of concerns that confront professionals in the national security field. At Georgetown, we are honored to play a role in working to prepare the next generation of leaders, scholars, and policymakers who will dedicate their lives to this work to respond to these complex and pressing issues. Two examples of Georgetown's engagement: our master's program in security studies offers our students courses ranging from foreign policy and strategy to military operations. At our law center, we combine research, teaching, policy analysis, and outreach through our Center on National Security and the Law. These efforts are guided by a defining value of our community: a commitment to service, to public service. And it's now my privilege to introduce the moderator of today's discussion, Fred Kemp, as I said, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Atlantic Council. A journalist, Mr. Kemp worked at the Wall Street Journal for more than 25 years in a variety of senior editorial and reporting roles. He was the longest-serving editor and associate publisher of the Wall Street Journal Europe. The beginning of his career with the paper was characterized by a focus on international and security issues. He served as the paper's chief diplomatic correspondent during the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany, and he opened the paper's Berlin bureau in 1990. He's the author of 4 books. His most recent, the New York Times bestseller, Berlin 1961, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and the World's Most Dangerous Place, was published in May of last year. He has a master's degree from Columbia University School of Journalism, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, sits on the advisory board of the Transatlantic Policy Network. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you all today Mr. Fred Kemp.
President DeGioia, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction of the panel and too kind introduction of me. It does remind me of, I mean, I'd written here, these are men who need no introduction, and so my introduction will not be so fulsome of men who don't need that kind of introduction. But I did hear The CEO of IBM once introduced a colleague of yours, Henry Kissinger, that way. And Henry Kissinger came up to the podium and said, and it was Lou Gerstner, then the CEO of IBM, and Henry said, "Lou, your introduction was far too modest." And so the next time Lou Gerstner stood up and introduced him again and talked about his Nobel Peace Prize and his books and his bestsellers and influence on history, and told the whole story about how he thought he needed no introduction, but he thought this time he had to give it because of the last time. To which Henry Kissinger came to the podium and said, "It is true, Lou, that no man needs an introduction less than I do, but no man appreciates one more." So thank you, President DeJoy. So I'm going, these men don't need the introduction. I will say, however, how unusual it is for this audience to have 3 former national security advisors, 2 who've served Republicans, 1 who served a Democrat, on the stage. They also, I have to be a little careful here because they're also board members of the Atlantic Council and therefore my bosses. This is a week on Friday when we will be launching at the Atlantic Council the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. General Jones is the chairman of the center. Steve Hadley has been one of the chief instigators of it. So we're very proud of that. And I say that I also send you greetings from another Georgetown Atlantic Council link. We're always proud to be here. A distinguished professor here, Senator Chuck Hagel, and he sends his greetings also to you, gentlemen. These 3 men embody American foreign policy at its best. Principled but tough-minded, bipartisan but decisive, acting consistently in the U.S. interest, but never ignoring and always including in our calculus the broader global context and the interests of our friends and allies. I say all that because it's just not to be taken for granted all the time in this town that these kinds of individuals thrive, and we're very happy for their public service, which is unique and long-lasting. I also was thinking in this introduction to talking about their years of total advice to U.S. presidents, and I could somehow total it up on an envelope. But it was really impossible because each of these gentlemen advised presidents before they got into office in their various positions, which were quite important. And then also afterward, they're still listened to in the highest councils of government. So that's why this is such a unique opportunity. I will start with a couple of initial questions, a couple of rounds. Then I'll come to the audience, and I'll go in the order that you gentlemen served as National Security Advisor. I do want to say one thing. I have had conversations before with these gentlemen about what the job is like. I talked to General Jones when he was in office, and I said, "General Jones, what's it like? What's it like in there being National Security Advisor with all these things going on?" And he said, "Have you ever been to a circus and seen the plate spinner?" And then he went on at some length explaining why that wasn't such a bad metaphor. Steve Hadley has called it a 12-burner stove. Since I'm going to be asking my first question of General Scowcroft, I'll leave it to use his definition of it. But I think what it is it's a dramatically changing job. When I asked Henry Kissinger what the National Security Advisor does, he said, he went back to the Kennedy administration, and he said that when he first started working for the Kennedy administration, he'd taken a trip to Europe, and he was invited to see President Kennedy. And afterwards, he talked to someone about it and was asked, "What did you tell the president?" And he told the president he had a lot of problems in Europe. And that person said to me, "The president knows he's got a lot of problems in Europe. So we have a lot of problems in Syria. We have a lot of problems in Iran. We have problems with the Eurozone crisis. We have issues with the South China Sea. It's a storm of issues coming at that." And then Kissinger said, You need to be useful to the president. You don't tell him a problem. You give him at least an indication of what we should do about it, because that's what presidents do. You can't expect him to sit there and ruminate about your definition of the problem. And so with that, I'd like to open with General Scowcroft. You've said before that this is a strategic moment, the likes of which haven't been seen since the Berlin Wall. I just recited some of the things coming at the US president. Sit down with either a re-elected, and all these men have had these conversations with presidents. You're either sitting down with a re-elected President Obama or a newly elected Governor Romney, and you've got to describe to him in what way is this strategic moment more important than the Berlin Wall, and how do you set your priorities? What do you do? Get us started with that.
I'm ready to just sit here and listen to you.
I'm done.
I'm enjoying it.
I'm done.
Well, one of the first things I like to say is that the job when I first got in it is very different from the job now, in this sense. When I first became National Security Advisor, the Cold War was still on. And the Cold War, that was the strategy. We had the strategy laid out for us. It was to put our arms around the Soviet Union and hold it and keep it from breaking out until it disintegrated. So that was a given. Now, we argued a lot with our friends and our allies and so on about the tactics of how you do this and how you do that. And in the background was the knowledge that if we made a serious mistake, we could end up in a thermonuclear war. So, but that was the framework. So we fiddled with the tactics, but the strategy was given. Now, the strategy is not a given. As a matter of fact, there is probably not a strategy which is all-encompassing for the world we're in now. It's a chaotic world. And so now we tend to be all tactics and no strategy. And the real problem is how you relate the different tactics to each other. And that is one of the principal things. It's all fine to say, well, we just use a little force here, and that'll straighten that problem out. But when you use a little force here, you create other problems that build on themselves. And pretty soon, you're dealing with the problems you've created by not thinking ahead rather than the ones you were trying to solve.
Well, let me do a quick follow-up on that, and to make this as informal as possible, though I will go down the line here. Whenever you want to jump in on something any one of the other of you has said, please do. Going back to the point, strategic moment, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Berlin Wall. Is that because there's a shifting of power from the U.S., from the West? We're entering a post-modern world. You know all the things that are being written about this period of time. Or how would you describe the shifting strategic moment? Why is it a shifting moment?
Well, it's shifting, first of all, because the Soviet Union, as this existential threat to everything we believe, is gone. And so that's why it is no longer the strategic center. But the world is changing even more fundamentally. We still, mentally, we live in a Westphalian world, the world of the nation state. Those independent units that are truly sovereign and don't depend or don't take orders from anybody else. But now globalization has come in and is poking holes in the Westphalian world. And the nation state can no longer do what it assumed it could do for its citizens. It needs to reach out for help. And so you've got this Westphalian system living in uneasy coexistence with this globalized world. And you say, are we losing power? The very nature of power is different now than it used to be. You know, you all in your textbook say, hey, these are the elements of national power, economy, this and that and the other. It's much more complicated now and much more diffused.
General Jones.
I would like to just add that I think the essential concept of what makes up national security has changed. It's much broader field now. You have to deal with economic issues, you have to deal with cybersecurity, you have to deal with a world that is largely asymmetric instead of symmetric. And as you reflect back on the 20th century, which wasn't that long ago, you almost yearn for the ordered ways of the 20th century. We had essentially a bipolar world, two different ideologies. We built institutions that were responsive to the world in that construct, and all of a sudden, the world has changed dramatically, and a lot of the threats that face us and will face you, the challenges, are very asymmetric. How do you respond to non-state actors, for example? They're not part of the United Nations. They don't deal symmetrically with the world as it is. So you have to understand the environment that you're in. And then if you're an incoming administration, you really have to get about the job of understanding that there's a difference between campaigning and governing very quickly. And the National Security Council is probably the first instrument of government that manages the interagency process in such a way that you don't miss a beat because you don't have much time to get ready. So I think the asymmetric nature of the world, the expanded notion of what constitutes national security is much more of a whole of government involvement. And that gets to, I think, and we can talk about this if you like, but it gets to a different way in which the United States engages in the 21st century with the world as it is, not as it was.
General Jones, you've said that great powers decline when they don't address the problems they have. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful statement. Does that mean, we look at our political polarization, we look at the fiscal crisis that's not being dealt with, you see a presidential campaign producing perhaps more heat than light on these issues. Does that mean, and you've said this before, that the key right now is getting our own house in order, that we have to step back a little bit from international and foreign engagement, or as President Obama has said, we have to do nation building at home to again reestablish ourselves? What's your view on that?
Well, I think that it's true that if you go back to the dominant countries or civilizations, that eventually they all come to an end for one reason or the other. And my observation is that one of the reasons they come to an end or they decline is because the world has changed, the environment has changed, and they've tried to hang on to the old model too long without adjusting to the new one. That's a challenge that faces us. We are, in my view, in a position right now of potentially great historical consequences because of our own internal economic situation that the health of which drives a lot of who we are in the rest of the world. And until you get your own house in order, it's kind of hard to, number one, manage to influence the world. And you certainly can't preach to others how to do it quite effectively. But I really believe that this is a very historical moment for the United States because so goes the economy, so goes just about everything else. We have, to your point about my oft-repeated quote that when a nation can no longer bring itself to do those things that it knows it must do in order to advance its future, then you have probably the first step of a decline in terms of influence. I'm an optimist on this. I think regardless of how precarious our situation is, I think that we have always risen to the occasion. So I don't subscribe to the inevitability of American decline, which I've heard every 10 years since I've been old enough to understand what Sputnik meant flying around the world. But it is a difficult moment, and in terms of national security writ large, we have to bring ourselves to be able to do the things that we know we must do if we're to continue to be as influential as I think our citizens expect us to be by 2050.
Thank you, General Jones. And I think to have a former Marine Commandant, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, as well as National Security Advisor, focusing on economic and competitiveness issues as an element of national security is a very interesting point. Steve Hadley, having just come back from Mideastern Europe, our friends are telling me that they see this as the most important election, or one of the most important elections since World War II for the United States and the world, but not because of who would be elected, but what kind of America will express itself on the world stage in the next 4 years. As you look at this big question for General Scowcroft, is this a big strategic shift? Are we at an inflection point in global history? Is that right? And if so, what kind of U.S. global leadership would you say to a newly elected president? What would you tell him about what he has to do on the world stage?
A number of things. One is we've focused a lot about challenges, and I had the job for President Bush to come in at about 7 or 8 minutes after 7 in the morning and tell him about the challenges that occurred overnight. And the trick for a president is to let him know there's a problem without sending him through the overhead, at 10 after 7 in the morning. So I would always, yeah, right. So I would come in and he'd say, Hadley, what's up? And I would say, well, Mr. President, there are a couple challenges that have emerged, which is a code for crisis. But there are a couple challenges that have emerged. And the president would say, Hadley, within every challenge, there is an opportunity for this country. And your job is to go find that opportunity and capitalize on it. So get going. But the point there, I think, is that we get overcome with the challenges. They are also opportunities for us to shape events and put policies in place that will shape events and lead to a better future. And the problem that Brent described that the modern national security advisor has, and this is the same thing General Jones said, there are so many challenges, read crises, coming into the White House, that you could spend all of your time reacting to events and not enough time putting in place policies that will shape events and therefore avoid crises in the future. And that's an issue of allocation of time. It's also an issue of structure. So first thing I would tell the president to get in the right frame of mind. There are challenges, but there are also opportunities. Secondly, he needs to think about reacting to events and shaping events, not just reacting to events. Third, I think we need to relook at the structures of national security. If it is not only harnessing all elements of governmental power and influence, but it's also using the private sector, our universities, our charitable foundations, our corporations, trying to conduct that symphony into coordinated policies that can advance our interests. We don't have structures that allow us to do that particularly well, and we need to shape and change our national security structures. Fourth, I think it means sometimes you have to place some bets. You have to have a vision of the future, and you have to be willing to make some big changes. We laud the generation of leaders from 1947 to 1949 who faced some of the most significant challenges ever. And we honor these men because they had a vision and they made some major institutional changes, the creation of NATO, a whole series of global institutions that allowed us to begin to shape that future. That's a challenge for a new president, to see where are those high leverage points.
Or we're in a historically comparable moment now.
I do. And finally, I want to echo what both Brent and Jim have said, that the element for the United States for being in a position to shape those events is our own power and authority in the world, and that really is dependent on us solving our political problem that prevents us getting our house in order in terms of debt and in terms of indebtedness and getting our economy growing. That undergirds everything we do in the world, is the source of our influence. It is why country allies rely on us, friends and others want to trade with us. It is a prerequisite to being in a position to shape the future for our children, our children's children. And it's not that hard. And one of the things I think the messages we need to send to you is this can be a very hopeful future for you. And I'll conclude with one remark. Bob Zellick was out in August in Aspen, and he said something very interesting. He said, I was talking to a European that I respect, and the European said to me, you know, the United States is one budget deal away from a return to global influence and prosperity. You've got shale oil, shale gas, cheap energy. It's going to make manufacturing attractive. It's going to put people to work. You just need to solve this political problem, and to show the world you can solve this political problem, get your house in order, and then get busy trying to shape the future. That's really what the new president needs to do.
Do the two of you agree global inflection point of the caliber of 1947, 49? Briefly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, similar but different. I think the thing that's different now is that there's really nobody else capable of leading the world. The Chinese can't do it. The Russians can't do it. The Europeans maybe eventually can, but they've got to get their own house. We're the only ones who can mobilize the world behind great enterprises. If we're contemplating our navel and all tied up with our internal problems, we can't do it. And the world desperately needs it. Because as I said at the outset, there's no obvious direction to go now, other than how do you improve man and his relationship to other men and the environment. We're the only ones that can do that. But we can't do it if we don't put our house in order.
Well, I'd just like to emphasize that I think that American leadership in the 21st century is going to probably take a little bit different shape than it had in the 20th century. I think it's normal. I think it's responsive to the environment that we face. For example, I think that the military response will probably be not the only instrument of choice, not the first instrument of choice in some cases. I think that we're entering into a period where the sum total of a whole of nation, whole of government approach to helping solve world problems is going to be upon us. And the good news is, I think that the United States is really still the only country that can do that. We have an enormously capable private sector. There are a lot of things that could be done, I think, within our government, particularly in the legislature, to help American companies be more competitive abroad. To all of our young people here, I would say that you're entering into an age of competitiveness. It's national, it's personal, but the ability to compete in this very much smaller, much more rapidly spinning world, to operate within the vortex of social media, and to deal with the rapidly changing events means that our decision-making process is not going to have the luxury of time in many, many cases. We're going to have to be quick. We're going to have to be agile. We're going to have to be responsive. And I think the private sector is going to be extremely important. And so the gap that exists historically between the public and the private sector is going to have to be tightened because we're competing against major countries and ideologies where there is no gap. The private sector and the public sector are in complete harmony, and some of these are democracies as well. So It's just a different style, but we've already seen many instances where the synergy between a closely coordinated public and private sector, it works to our advantage. I also think that the third leg is going to be other institutions like NGOs and the like, universities, as Steve pointed out. You can dial up a response package to in response to a particular set of events. That doesn't necessarily mean that it always has to be military. The three elements for me, the major elements of any engagement, will be obviously a security element, but also an economic element. And thirdly, a governance rule of law element to help developing countries do the things that they must do in order to be successful. Energy, to me, is a tremendous national security issue that has been unaddressed so far by any administration since President Nixon. We've always talked about it. We've lamented about it. We generally react to the price of oil and gas at the pump, and then when it goes down, we forget about it. But if you wanted to make a change in the world, energy is one of the areas where American leadership could be dominant for the foreseeable future. And it makes sense to help the developing world, who is approaching in their own internal development the pollution stage, the fossil fuel burning stage, to help them skip that stage and get to clean energy and the like. The United States has more of everything within our borders than any other country in the world. But yet we have no national energy strategy, and the gap between the public and the private sector is still too wide.
Steve, let me take this from the macro to the micro, and then after this discussion, we'll go to the audience. And the macro is now. It's the tragic killing of our ambassador to Libya. It's the firestorm of anti-American rage that followed here and there. But more precisely, it's the president turning to you and saying, what do I do about Syria? What do I do about Iran? We've seen the reports of Netanyahu's importance with us, but I think in a very micro sense, perhaps focus particularly on Syria in this firestorm of events going on, and tell me where the opportunity is in that challenge.
Good luck.
We're listening.
These are very difficult challenges, and particularly after the tragic death of an ambassador and several others, loyal Americans serving our country, we got to pull together. But I think, and I've been reluctant and continue to be reluctant to criticize this administration because, I have some appreciation of the problems they're facing. But it's this issue between crisis management and shaping events. And yes, we are in a period where, in response, really, I think, a pretext of the tape that was made in the United States, there are a lot of people expressing rage. A lot of that is extremist groups taking advantage of an opportunity to try to demonstrate against the United States and to take some fairly moderate governments that are post-revolutionary in the Middle East that want to work with the United States and to try to shove them away from us. And the worst reaction to this tragedy would be for us to pull away from the Middle East. We need to engage the Middle East. It's very fashionable for people to say, well, the United States doesn't have much influence. It's in a way an excuse not to act. We have a lot of influence, but in any event, we do have influence, and there's no excuse not to use it to try to shape a better future. And the real thing I'm worried about in the Middle East is what's going on in Syria, and has been going on now for 18 months. It is a struggle that is becoming increasingly violent, increasingly sectarian, Sunni against Shia, and increasingly opening the door for al-Qaeda that loves to exploit chaos for its own agenda. And it is now to the point where we have the risk of a sectarian war in Syria that not only destabilizes Syria, but that destabilizes Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and potentially Turkey. So the opportunity, quite frankly, is to move with countries in the region like Turkey and Jordan and others and Iraq who are waiting for U.S. leadership to bring an end to Assad in Syria and to bring an end to that regime sooner. Because we've seen the longer it goes, the more people die, the more sectarian it is, the more it upsets the neighborhood. So the question is, and we're destabilizing the neighbor, question is how to do it. We can talk about it. I think the way you do it is basically to empower those people that are fighting for their future and give them the weapons so that they can topple this regime themselves. But I think the mindset that any president needs to have is this is not just a single crisis management situation. We handled Tunisia, we handled Libya, we handled Egypt, we handled Syria. This one runs the risk of a meltdown in the Middle East. And therefore, it is a strategic challenge, but it is also a strategic opportunity to try to further emphasize and establish yet another example where Sunni and Shia and Kurds and other minorities are working together to define a common future, which is what the Middle East needs. Because elsewhere, for hundreds of years, the model has been Sunnis oppress Shia, Shia oppress Sunni. That won't work. That won't bring stability. That won't bring a better life for folks. And we have an opportunity to establish a different model. We started that in Iraq, very controversial. We need to try to start that in Syria and bring this to an end.
And General Jones, do you agree?
I agree with Steve emphatically. One of my favorite sayings is that virtual presence is actual absence. And if you think about how you want these things to come out, and we have an interest in that, obviously, you have to understand that you just can't sit back and hope. Hope is not a strategy. Since the fall of the Shah of Iran, particularly in the Middle East, the people that have emerged from these toppling of dictators, if you will, are generally the people who are the best organized, and the people who are the best organized are generally radical. And so if you don't want to go through another bad period, you need to do things that counter that reality. They're the best organized. I think Steve's points about working with friends and allies in the region who also have significant equities in this, like Turkey specifically. But the presence of the United States with these allies can maybe, for example, bring back, help rekindle the Israeli-Turkish relationship, which would be instrumental. I mean, there are two countries that really have vested interest in how this whole thing plays out. I do think that the Syrian question is particularly important because of what it means with regard to Iran and its future. A new Syria that gives hope for its people and more freedom and more opportunity would be devastating for the Iranian goals and aspirations. But I think that we need to see more international involvement, more concern, more assistance to the people who are fighting for this ideal. And when the day comes that Assad leaves office, one way or the other, if you don't have a plan in place, it's already too late.
General Scowcroft, I wonder if you can pick this up. Interesting listening to these two gentlemen, but there is no UN Security Council resolution. You have the Chinese and the Russians against any action, very different situation for a lot of reasons than Libya, a country that's tired of Afghanistan, tired of Iraq. You're talking to the President of the United States, you're looking at the stakes, and I think the stakes have been outlined very dramatically here. What does he practically do? What does he do in Syria, and in what context should he view it?
I think that's a fundamental question. And it would be nice if Syria were as compact and differentiated that the answers are obvious. I don't think they are. I think if Assad left tomorrow, you wouldn't have a very different Syria. Syria and Lebanon are the most intermixed countries possible in the world. Ethnically, religiously, they're very, very complicated. Yes, you have a Shia Sunni. That goes to the Turks' attitude, the Iraqis' attitude. They're not all on the same side on this one. If we intervene in Syria, it is not obvious who comes out ahead and who we want to come out ahead. The majority is about 60% Sunni, but they're very different kinds. And the Druze, the Christians, a lot, the Palestinian refugees in Syria don't want the Sunnis to win because the Assad regime has been more protective of them than the Sunnis were. This is extremely complicated. And I think we need to talk more seriously with the Russians. The Russians are holding on to Syria is their last foothold in the Middle East. When I first joined the NSC, the Russians were dominating over half the Middle Eastern countries. Now they're down to one. If they lose Assad, they're finished. They have an equity in preserving some of their position in Syria. So theoretically, they ought to be willing to help. I think it is really complicated, but I think especially a military intervention in Syria would put another country in our basket. We already have Iraq, we have Afghanistan, we don't need another one.
You would not go further than where the Obama administration is now?
I would go further in some respects. I think we need to go a lot further with the Turks. It's not clear to me what the Turks want, but what they need is a huge amount of help with over 100,000 refugees they have.
I agree with Brent. He's described the problem in Syria very well. The problem is we do nothing. The outcome is going to, I think, increasingly be worse, and the risk of violence against those minority groups go up. So the only solution I can see, and this is where the opportunity is in the challenge, is you've got to work with the opposition, and the administration is trying to do this, and it's very frustrating work. You've got to convince this opposition, the core of which is Sunni, that they need to include representatives of these other groups, give them a genuine role, and have a message to Syrian society that the new Syria has a place for all minorities and there will be protected. That they don't need to cling to Assad, and indeed, if they go down with Assad, it'll make their inclusion in the new Syria even difficult. Is this hard work? Absolutely.
No fly zone responsibility to protect?
But the answer is there's no real alternative, because if we leave it alone, it's going to descend into chaos. On the Russian point, I think Brent is right, but I think we need a tactical shift. Right now, Assad thinks that the Russians and the Chinese can save him because they prevented any action in the Security Council. And I think in the short run, the president needs to say, I'm not dealing with the Security Council. I'm going to deal with the countries in the region, Turkey, Jordan, and all the rest, and we're going to deal with Assad. And when that's clear, I think it'll help cause some of these groups to break away from Assad. I think it may bring the Russians to their senses. And once that train gets moving and Assad is going, then there's a question of opening the door back for the Russians to come in. Maybe they can, at some point in the end, be part of a solution for an end game. But for the moment, we've got to, I think, in the short run, break the lock that the Russians and the Chinese through the UN have had, because they're impeding any action. And again, my analysis is the longer this goes, the worser it gets, and the more out of control the solution that Brent describes. Is this a hard problem? Absolutely. But, you know, it's not going to get any easier just leaving it on the table.
One thing I should have mentioned is Lakhdar Brahimi, who is the new envoy, is one of the wisest men that I know. I think we ought to be looking for ways we can help him to maybe get a ceasefire or whatever he thinks, and listen to his judgment. He's out there now talking to both sides to see what, if there is, that we're missing that might give us some leverage we don't have now.
One last comment, Chairman Jones, before I go to the audience.
Yeah, no, I think this is an important question, obviously. I just want to make sure that I'm clear that I don't advocate military intervention in this.
Including a no-fly zone, you wouldn't advocate.
Well, I mean, you know, you can
the
talk about
rebels
things
could be
like that, but I'm
slaughtered.
not talking about putting boots on the ground, okay?
Yep.
But
This is about arming.
that's right. But I do think that when the United Nations proves itself to be ineffective, as it has, in my view, the United States has a moral obligation to find another solution, however temporary it might be. For example, to Steve's point about opportunities, there's a tremendous opportunity here for the United States to work with moderate Arab countries on this problem. There's a tremendous opportunity to work with an ally, a NATO ally in Turkey. It's a tremendous opportunity to bring Israel into the equation. And by the way, although you have to do that skillfully, don't think that there wouldn't be willingness to do that on a quiet level. But to wait and let the thing metastasize even more, escalate even more, is a big mistake. I thought that that on the humanitarian side, that after the Libya operation, a great move would have been to take the USS Hope and put it off the coast of Libya and fly out any of the civilians who were wounded and maimed in the fighting. And I still think that's a good idea for, you know, for the refugees in Syria. But I don't think that a great nation with the privilege of leadership in the world can sit back and watch this thing escalate like this.
Thank you very much. Let me go to the audience, and I think the way it works is people stand in front of the microphones. If you'll identify yourself, and please do put a question mark at the end of whatever short statement you may make. The only thing I'll say is this was quite intentional. I think what you saw here was a way of macro thinking about where the world is, and then a way of micro drilling down on an issue that's very real, huge stakes, and no easy solution. And these men have been in a position where you can't just write a paper about it and you can't do an op-ed. You actually have to decide. You have no option, and even indecision is a decision in a way. So please.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Billy Birdsell, and I'm a master's candidate at the Security Studies program. And General Jones, it's a pleasure to see you again, sir. You spoke to my basic school class some years ago. It's been mentioned that Al-Qaeda has killed one of our ambassadors and launching attacks. And very ironically, the #1 book selling in America this week is written by one of the SEALs on the Bin Laden raid. And when General Socroft was the National Security Advisor, the Joint Special Operations Command didn't even exist. And in 1998, Steve Call wrote in his book that then National Security Advisor Sandy Berger wouldn't authorize elements of the United States to kill Osama bin Laden because there was a very different understanding about the use of force in that sort of situation. And since then, while Mr. Hadley and General Jones have been the National Security Advisor, we've taken a much more kinetic approach to addressing some of these asymmetric, globalized, transnational, non-state actor threats that have been mentioned. And can you gentlemen please talk about the role that direct action, be it under Title 10 or Title 50, took while you were the National Security Advisor, how you thought about it, how you advised the President about it, and what you think we should do with that particular tactic in addressing this global threat that we face all over the world?
General Jones, since you're the most recent serving National Security Advisor.
It'd be good to get
Yes.
Steve,
Yeah.
because he was at the outset of that, and then I'll be happy to follow up.
Okay, great. Which of you would like to handle that first?
The 9/11 Commission actually found that President Clinton had authorized CIA to use lethal authorities to get Osama bin Laden. And you can look at that, but it's important. I want to do justice to the history, because this sort of what we used to call the war on terror has been really the project now of 3 administrations, actually 4, because a lot of it goes back to what Vice President Bush did even in the Reagan administration. So this is something, there's a continuity over a lot of administrations. The framework of President Bush and the war on terror was take the fight to the enemy overseas, treat those who harbor terrorists in the same terms as the terrorists, and at the same time promote democracy, freedom, social justice as an alternative to the vision of the terrorists. It gives people some hope rather than despair. And to involve now over 80 countries in that effort against terror. Direct action has a role to play, but it is a piece of an overall and integrated strategy, and I think that's how it has to be seen. It is a new instrument, starting in Iraq, and since the integration between intelligence and operations is remarkable, what has now been achieved. And I'd like to hear General Jones on this, it offers an opportunity that we may, in places like Yemen and Somalia, be able to deal with the terrorist challenge without having to do the kind of thing we did in Afghanistan and Iraq, but through a combination of intelligence sharing with the local government, training and strengthening local security forces and law enforcement, helping local governments get legitimacy among their people, sharing intelligence with them, and doing some operations through remote vehicles, air vehicles, special operations forces. There may be a way to keep the country safe using these different set of tools in places like Yemen and Somalia and the like. And that is sort of an evolution, I think, in the strategy of how we deal with these problems militarily. But I'll go back to General Jones, because he was the guy in the hot seat for after I left.
Well, in a perfect world, of course, you'd like to have all of your allies agree with what you do and give you permission to do whatever it is you think needs to be done. That's not a perfect world, unfortunately. The direct action missions have a place, but nobody should, I think, make the mistake of thinking it's a panacea for a long-term solution. It's not very strategic, it's very tactical. And while we can marvel at the precision, the progress and the precision that has been achieved in the last 10 or 15 years, and by the way, Steve's absolutely right about the Clinton administration, and I happen to be serving for a Secretary of Defense during the Clinton administration, and Osama bin Laden was clearly someone that, had we had the kind of precision we had, we might have done something different. But for reasons having to do with the potential for mass casualties, we didn't always take advantage of it. But today's a different day. But to the instrument, I think you have to be, as much as possible, you have to incorporate it in your overall strategy, and you have to incorporate it in how you deal with sovereign nations, so that if you do use it, it's in their benefit as well. In the case of Pakistan, which was certainly easily perhaps my biggest frustration as National Security Advisor, we could never really get a clear sense of what the Pakistani military was willing to do or not willing to do. Eventually it became clear, but we certainly in 2009 hoped that we would have a willing partner that would help us by eliminating the safe havens for terrorists and the leaders that went with it. When it became clear that they weren't going to, in order to reduce the number of Americans who were being killed and allies who were being killed in Afghanistan, we really had no choice but to go after the leadership in this very tactical, targeted way with tremendous success. But I think the lesson here is you want to get it within the envelope of sovereign nation to sovereign nation relationships and not have to resort to taking things into your own hands that leave you open to international criticism.
Do you want to pick that up? And what I'm going to try to do, because I see quite a few questions, keep your questions short, and if you could say who you'd like to address it to, and we'll see if we can get a little more back and forth, please.
Sure. Sikandar Kiani, senior at the School of Foreign Service. General Jones, you already mentioned Pakistan. So how would the challenges for a new Republican government or the same Democratic government differ in dealing with Pakistan, given next year it's expected the government and, more importantly, the military leadership for Pakistan would change? Maybe you guys could comment on how the challenges might get better. Or
I couldn't hear that.
I didn't.
Say that one more time, I'm sorry.
So the military leadership of Pakistan is expected to change next year, so is the government.
Yeah.
Where do you see the direction of U.S. relationship going with Pakistan with those expected changes?
So step down of General Kiani,
There'll be presidential elections, then
right.
parliamentary elections,
Right.
new government.
Right.
Well, from my standpoint, since I mentioned Pakistan, I would hope that in the interest of Pakistan, not the interest of the United States, that Pakistan finds a way to bring in an era of civilian leadership in which the military plays its proper but subordinate role. My experience with my dealings with Pakistan was that's not the case. I mean, the civilian leadership could be very, very well intentioned, but the military was certainly going to do exactly what it wanted to do. And so, as I said, it was my personal biggest frustration, I think, because I think that had we been able to, had Pakistan as a country been able to accept what it was, I think, that the rest of the world was offering, and particularly the United States, which would have transformed within a few years, of course, but much of the economic situation in Pakistan that would benefit the Pakistani people. We'd be in a different place today in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, that was not achieved. But so I think with change there is hope. I'm hopeful that the next generation of military leaders will subordinate themselves to civilian control, and the next generation of civilian leaders will assert that control.
Please.
My name is Brandon Oliver, and I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service. I'm just wondering where the U.S. should draw the line in terms of humanitarian intervention with military forces, because we have a history of doing it in the Balkans and also in Libya, but where do we draw that line in deciding if we should intervene in terms of saving people? And that's
responsibility to protect. Where do you draw the line in responsibility to protect humanitarian intervention?
That's really a very good question. The UN has come close to declaring the responsibility to protect as a world mandate. But the responsibility to protect, that is when a country, when the leadership of a country cannot or does not protect major elements of its population, it's the duty of the UN, the international community, to intervene. And that is a very appealing notion. Unfortunately, Article 2 of the UN Charter says that nothing in this charter shall give the right of the organization to interfere in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of its members. So we have a fundamental conflict here between the charter itself and this new law, if you will, world law that's developing. We need to work on that, and we need to clarify what it means and how it means it. I think it is a step forward, but I think it is ill-defined and leads to confusion and even worse now.
Do you want to pick up that at all, Steve?
No,
I agree with that.
perfect.
Please.
Hi, my name is Rafael Perez. I'm a senior in the School of Foreign Service, and my question had to do with the role of the U.S. leadership in the world. So all of your comments today have basically implied that the U.S. needs to be the leader of the world for some reason. Yet if you look around today in the world, you find a number of countries who are not only unwilling to follow us, but also actively opposed to our leadership. So at what point do you reassess our role in the world and maybe check our extremely aggressive and interventionist approach to the world, and maybe focus on the problems that are pressing here at home?
Third question.
Well, we've all said that we need to fix the problems here at home, both because we need to fix the problems here at home to have a more prosperous society, but also because they are a foundation for our role in the world. So I think there's no conflict. And I would say to a new president, you know, you've got a priority. Your priority both is your top domestic priority and your top national security priority is the same thing: fix the economy, get our economy growing, deal with it and the deficit. Secondly, what General Scowcroft was saying is, you know, there is some reallocation in the world in terms of power and influence that results from the 2008 financial crisis. It is beginning to be reflected in global institutions. It should. The G20, which includes additional countries like India and Brazil and others, replacing the G7, the G8. That's all to the good. But, you know, President Bush used to sometimes say to me, well, you know, this is a problem. We've got a lot of problems. Why don't we give this to the United Nations, or why don't we give this to NATO? And it always made me uncomfortable. And I used to say to him, Mr. President, these institutions are terrific institutions. They have some capability, and there are forms for bringing the nations of the world together on a problem. But all of these institutions need to be animated by the energy and leadership of their individual country members. And preeminently, that tends to be the United States and a few others. So yes, there's been some reorientation. Yes, there needs to be strengthening of international institutions. Yes, countries like China, India, Brazil need to be given a larger role. But these institutions are not self-executing. They need leadership from within. And Brent's point is there are not a lot of countries who either are capable or trusted to provide that leadership. And that's why, even though there is a diffusion of power in the world, even though that's going to change how the United States leads in the world, I think Brent's right, and I think General Jones would agree, we need to get our house in order for domestic purposes, but also so we can help provide leadership for the international community in dealing with these problems.
I think your attitude is understandable. The world doesn't appreciate it. To hell with them. Let's just take care of ourselves. We're not talking about leadership in the world as an altruistic thing that we owe the world. It's in the America's interest to have a world which sustains the kind of things we believe in, which we can trade with, which helps America's prosperity. So this leadership is not something we bestow on the world. We're the only ones that can do it, but it's very essential to America's well-being that we do it.
Thank you for the question.
Hello, I'm John Askinis, a senior in the School of Foreign Service. It's kind of a follow-on question to that. America has created this international system that is more beneficial to liberty, democracy, and free enterprise than has ever existed in the world. And it's done so through leadership in a wide variety of spectrums. And it will continue to do so in the coming decades. However, it seems inevitable for a lot of reasons that America's economic dominance, and therefore, according to, depending on who you ask, military dominance, will not continue in the same way it has. So America won't be able to continue to afford to fight two major military operations at the same time. So my question is, Does America's global leadership depend on global military hegemony? Thank you.
Let me start with General Jones here, and let me also add to that question. I've just returned from the Gulf, and I saw this remarkable Al Dhafra air base, where American power is just powerful there. But you talk to Gulf officials, and they say, "Look, we know in times of war you're going to be there, and we have the security guarantee. But right now in the Arab awakening, we need you engaged every day in a much different way, and we don't think you are, in the sense that you have to be." So just sharpening that, you picking up that question, but also taking it specifically.
It's really an excellent question, because it really does pose the challenge of whether we can pivot into a different kind of engagement. The short answer to your question is I don't think the American military is going to play the same role it did in the 20th century. Hopefully there is not going to be another global war or two in this century as we had in the last century. But it is going to be an element of projecting influence and the like. I think that it's likely that. Well, let me just give a personal sense. I do a lot of traveling in different parts of the world, and privileged to meet with heads of state and senior officials in different governments, and inevitably the question comes around to, we really love the United States. You guys have done so much, to make the world what it is, but we don't see you anymore. We see Chinese companies coming in and actually without much competition, just buying up all natural resources, getting contracts, and so on and so forth. Where's America? And that bothers me a little bit, because if that's the case, and I think in some parts of the world it is, it means that we're not competing. We're not competing adequately enough. And I think that's part of this reshaping of our response package, where you can, in fact, respond with public sector involvement. You can respond with private sector involvement. You can respond with NGOs, and depending on what you're trying to do, your strategy can be shaped appropriately, and you should be able to call on those things and harmonize them. This is a different model than in the 20th century, where we were so dominant that you could actually not pay much attention to American industry because they do just fine all by themselves. But that's not the case now when you have a China where the public and private policy are just are slammed together at the hip, and a rising Brazil and India where the government and the private sector are one, and so the decisions that they make are very rapid as opposed to ours. And so we need to fix the things that we need to fix. We need to change some laws. We need to reform our export control reforms. We need to do a lot of things to enable the American giant to be that giant again. But it's going to be completely different than I think having the world's most powerful armed forces by a factor of 12, if they're not going to be as instrumental in shaping the new world order in the 21st century. And I think that's the case.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Lieutenant Doug Gates. I'm a graduate of the SSP program here, and I now teach at the Naval Academy. My question is for General Scowcroft and for General Jones, since you've served on both sides of the divide. As national security advisors,
and it's nice that you ask an Air Force man and a Marine. I mean, it's
In the role of national security advisor, what were your relationships like with senior uniformed military leadership? And did you think they were more collaborative or cooperative? And were those relationships dependent on the roles that each of you were occupying, or was it on personalities and personal relationships that you built?
Well, that's a very hard question to answer. When I became National Security Advisor, I retired from the military. Partly a matter of principle and partly a matter of U.S. law at that time. I like to think that there was a level of comfort on the part of the military in the Pentagon that might not have been there had I not had a military background. But I don't know. I never asked that. I never sought support from the military outside of my general role. So it's hard for me to answer that question. It is a question, I think, that is asked more by people outside than by people inside. But Jim, I don't know whether you had a different notion.
I thought it was a net plus in terms of your ability to, my ability to understand the world and certainly how our military culture thinks about it. But in my own dealings, I dealt with the Secretary of Defense, the civilian leader of the Defense Department, and not that directly with my former colleagues, because that's the way our system works. Now, with Secretary Gates, normally when he came to the White House, he brought the chairman of the Joint Chiefs with him, and that was his call. There was no, he didn't have to do that, but that's what he did. And meetings with the president once a week, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense were there. But when I pick up the telephone to call the Pentagon, I didn't call a former colleague who happened to be, in an important position to get a military viewpoint. I got everything I needed from Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and civilian officials. So you can't spend 40 years in uniform and not be colored a little bit by your experience and know something about it. But I generally factored that in. It helped me understand things, but I didn't carve out a special relationship with the uniformed military.
What do you, from your perspective, do you see any difference?
It's all very familiar.
Yeah.
That is to say, I dealt with the Secretary of Defense. If he told me I should deal directly with the chairman, I would,
Okay.
but I would never do it without having done so. I also made it a practice. I never called out to the field to the combatant commanders. That was, reaching into the chain of command. And the National Security Advisor isn't in the chain of command. It's the President, Secretary of Defense, and then down. So I think that's right. Military experience helps you understand what you're hearing, but the patterns of interaction are pretty well established, and they're consistent with the notion of civilian control of the military. That's one of the things that makes us different than Pakistan. It's the strength of our system.
Thank you for the question.
Good evening. I'm VP Dow, a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service. I want to shift the region of focus to Asia. I was just wondering, the issues in the West Pacific right now concerning China and its neighbors are seen as sort of the issue of a rising power challenging an existing power, here being China challenging the United States. How locked are we in looking at the situation in that kind of framework? Or is there any other realistic way we can tackle the issues we're facing in the West Pacific in a different framework without looking at China as absolutely our geopolitical adversary? And is there a realistic way to do that or not? Thank you.
General Skokov, maybe you can pick that up first and at the same time deal with South China Sea issues / pivot to Asia in that context as well.
Well, I think our relationship with China needs to be looked at in the light of the new world, not the 20th century world. I don't think this is a zero-sum game between us and the Chinese. They are a rising power, of course. They're getting stronger. They've had enormous economic success. They also have enormous political problems, economic problems, all kinds of problems. But as you look at the issues around the world, the general issues that preoccupy us, we and the Chinese are not fundamentally at loggerheads on any of them. So I think, this is a relationship where we didn't used to see the Chinese anywhere. You know, when Nixon went to China in 1972, we had no contact with him except hostile in Korea and in the offshore islands. We had no contact with him at all. That developed only gradually, and now we run into them in all kinds of different areas. So and we have very different ideas. We have different histories, different cultures, different methods of thinking. So we're very different people. But I don't see the irreconcilability that we tend to look when we look at rising powers like Germany in the late 19th century, like Japan before World War II. I don't think we ought to look at it in that way. The South China Sea thing is a very interesting and a very complicated issue. It came up a couple of years ago, and it's not clear exactly who brought it up, whether we did or whether the Chinese did. But the issue relates to a line that the Chinese some centuries ago drew in the area as being the Chinese border, and modern law as to how you differentiate territory as sovereign territory, as your exclusive economic zone, and other kinds of things. It's a very complicated issue, and we are not taking a position on it. What we're saying is it needs to be worked out by the parties. Well, the Chinese want to work it out bilateral because they're the big guy and all the others are the individual little guys. But this is a part of a, if you will, minuet between the Chinese growing self-confidence and wanting to assert themselves and their sovereignty farther and farther from their shores, and us insisting on freedom of the seas and rights of passage and so on. I think it is not a fundamental issue. It could become a very vexatious issue if it's not carefully handled. But I believe that we can handle it carefully and that we will handle it carefully. Of course, it would be helpful if the U.S. Senate would ratify the Law of the Sea Convention, because we have no standing right now.
Just a comment, I completely agree with General Scowcroft. But you know, when I heard the term pivot towards Asia, I winced because you know, words are important, and the people that you're pivoting towards interpret it one way, and the people you're pivoting away from, because that's what pivot implies, interpret it another way. So if you're an African leader, for example, or a European or a South American, you're saying to a kind of a globally influential nation, when a globally influential nation says something like that, that causes all kinds of think tank business. And what does that mean? The Atlantic Council likes those kinds of things because it keeps them employed.
We want to pivot with our allies, which is a unilateral pivot. I thought was sort of old think,
but it does carry, and I'm told that the new word now is rebalance, and you know, but really the pivot's out of the bag, you know. So. But it is important. Words are important, and you should choose them carefully. And sometimes actions should speak louder than words.
I also want to say, as a former Georgetown basketball player, General Jones knows about pivots. So
I know a lot about bench time too. Where I was able to study the game.
A Chinese last year asked me to explain to him what pivot really means in English.
Please.
Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nader Zaidi. I'm a senior in the college here at Georgetown. This question was relevant 2 years back with the Quran burning that was organized by Pastor Terry Jones down in Florida and its effect in Afghanistan. So in light of the killing of the late great Ambassador Christopher Stevens, is there a point that as a national security advisor that you would advise a curtailing or a tempering of certain forms of our freedoms of expression in order to protect the lives of Americans abroad?
I'll do it very briefly, and I say this not as a constitutional lawyer, not as an expert on freedom of speech, but common sense-wise, we always used to say freedom of speech does not allow you to yell fire in a crowded theater. And I think the kind of thing we saw last week is exactly that. And one of the things we've got to figure out as a country, particularly in the context of the new media, is how do we draw that line between protected speech and speech that really is fire in a theater and is going to put innocent lives at risk. There is a line there, and we've got a challenge to figure out how to draw that.
I think we have maybe time for 2 more questions, so, yeah.
Thank you guys so much for being here today. It's such an honor and privilege to hear you speak to us. My name is Trip Taylor. I'm a first year in the MSFS graduate program. And the gentleman 2 questions before actually touched on this general theme, but I'd like to take it in a little bit more specific direction. Now, General Jones, you talk a lot about the need to adjust this new model. So given the changing balance of power relationships, particularly in places like East Asia, how sustainable do you think that our current security arrangements are, particularly things like mutual defense treaties, are in light of these changing relationships? And if they're not sustainable and they need to be adjusted, how can we do so in a pragmatic way without letting our allies feel like we're abandoning them? Thank you.
And why don't I pick up the last question too here? Or let's pick that one up, Chair.
Well,
sorry.
I think that it's interesting that one of the realities of what's going on in Asia right now are countries like the Philippines, who asked us to leave not too long ago, are now sent almost the entire Filipino government came to Washington recently to ask us to come back. South Vietnam, or Vietnam, but Vietnam, North and South, I'm sorry, I'm dating myself a little bit here. I'm a pretty good date too, I think. But Vietnam is an former adversary, really worried about the rise of China, and has asked us to consider more engagement. Taiwan obviously has always been of that mind, but you're seeing with this pivot announcement, you're seeing some reactions on the global playing field that would tend, to your question, would tend to lead me to conclude that we could be in an enviable position of, if not redefining and rewriting some of these treaties, but at least giving them more meaning. But I agree with all 3 of us, I think, agree on the same thing, that the likelihood of a major conflict, with China and any other countries, is probably pretty slim. But the likelihood of kind of brush fire challenges that have to be responded to, and where presence is actually important, being there is a deterrent, and it's a deterrent that works both ways. So I think that we're into a period of much more negotiations with maybe some in Asia in particular over some of the issues we've talked about, some occasional spikes. The trick is to make sure that those are just brush fires and not forest fires.
I met with a quasi-Chinese official, sort of quasi-government official, and I made an impassioned plea that our existing military alliances had actually been a force of stability in the region and had facilitated the peaceful rise of China. I was very eloquent. And at the end, he said, Mr. Hadley, you're right. Now, I'm confident that was not in the reporting cable that went back to Beijing, but I think it is nonetheless true. There will be some adjustment in these relationships, but I think they continue to be an element of stability in Asia.
Last question.
Hi, I'm James Marshall. I'm a senior in the SFS. I have a question for General Jones regarding Iran. General Jones, do you believe that the Obama administration should set clear red lines regarding Iran's nuclear program? And if so, what do you think those red lines should be?
I actually believe if you go back and look at the president's pronouncements on this issue, back even in 2009, you can see where he was very clear in terms of the national purpose and the national goal. To my knowledge, that hasn't changed. But, and I think our policy is informed by pretty good intelligence, and that it's quite possible that the sanctions, first of all, I think the sanctions are having an effect. I think that they caused the regime to come back to the IAEA, even though the talks haven't amounted to much. You notice a country like Turkey, for example, which was originally in 2010 really was championing the Iranian position, is now seen a little bit, has seen the light. I think you have to be careful about how you articulate what your red lines are. There's no question in my mind what our policy is, and there's no question in my mind that that a nuclear weapons capable Iran is a clear danger. I mean, to its neighbors, they've said so. It's a country that would probably trigger a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and it's a country that would clearly probably export that technology to, for the first time, non-state actors. And I think, in my view, non-state actors having weapons of mass destruction changes the world that you and I live in. So I'm comfortable with what I hear from our government. I think we have worked on this. I know for a fact firsthand, and I think Steve did as well, worked very, very assiduously with our friends and allies. We gave it a good shot in 2009 to let Iran declare itself and to show itself to be reasonable if they wish to be reasonable. They haven't shown that. And but I do think that that there are still some options that can be played out before we get to any kind of kinetic stage.
General Skokov, do you want to draw the red line?
No, I agree completely with Jim's approach.
I'm pessimistic. I think we should play out options. I'm pessimistic, and I worry that about this time next year, we'll be kind of out of options. And that will require a president to make some very tough decisions.
I think that may be the case, but you know, we have changed the whole issue of Iranian missiles from, or Iranian nuclear weapons from anybody else who's ever gotten nuclear weapons. We didn't have this argument when Israel got its weapons, when Pakistan got its weapons. We had a big problem with India, but it was sort of separate. So we need to be careful how we proceed here.
If I could just come back to, I think, what is a central point here, and that is that the Middle East is still, and by the Middle East problem, I mean the Israeli-Palestinian question, is still the big rock that has never been moved. And the fallout from any hint of progress in solving this problem, the ripple effect, would just about affect everything else that's going on in the world. And so I think that the danger of the Prime Minister's position in Israel is that he is thinking tactically, he's thinking regionally, and he's not thinking strategically. And you have three of the former members of, very influential members of the government, the director, the head of Mossad, chief of staff of the army, and the head of Shin Bet, all left the government and are openly critical of the Prime Minister's position vis-a-vis striking Iran. And so the danger is that you could be stampeded into doing something that would have no basis in fact, but a political forcing function that would cause a cataclysmic regional war.
We need to be thoughtful, not impetuous.
That's right.
I think that's a great line to end on. We need to be thoughtful, not impetuous. So with that, General Jones has once said the 21st century is not going to be a century where you can sit back and take a lot of time making decisions because of the amount of issues we face every day. It's a daunting proposition to think that you can take time to reflect, but you have to. And so I think what you've really allowed us to do, the three of you, is reflect not only on the immediacy of some of these issues and the difficulty in solving them, but also the underlying requirement to come up with the strategy and a way of thinking about this really remarkably changed world that we live in. So on behalf of the audience in Georgetown, thank you so much for this time.